That was great. They like reveal them from behind a curtain and then they walk forth. It's like a game show.
Hey Ben, I'm honored to be the second participant in this game show. But you made the argument that the gender pay gap is a myth.
Yes.
And one of the main reasons that this is the case is because that female STEM education is at a lower level than it is for men. Females are continually discouraged to not go into STEM fields at a rate that's like much lower than men are. So I was wondering what you feel about this argument, and like, you know, how do you like think it should be remedied, or like nothing?
Well, I
mean,
mean, I think that it's free country. You can choose what profession to go into. If the idea is that the pay gap is largely due to profession choice, that's obviously true. If you look at a lot of dangerous professions, firemen, people who work on oil rigs, it tends to be men because men want to go into those professions. It's also true that men tend to spend more hours in the workplace. It's also true that women tend to take more time off with babies. That's not a bad thing, by the way. It's not a rip on women. It's always bewildering to me when feminists are like, it's terrible that women take time off to be with their babies. Why? I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, completely agree. But I think there is a societal discouragement for women to go into these particular fields. I was wondering if, like, you as like a problem.
I don't see a ton of evidence that there's societal disparagement of women going into being a firefighter. What I actually see is that there's an affirmative action program in many of these cases for women going into things like firefighting, because there's now an affirmative attempt to get women into these fields. I was referring to
STEM fields like science, technology.
So, okay, so the STEM. Okay, so James Damore has an interesting memo that got him fired from Google on this. But it is certainly true that when you look at, for example, what women major in college, the number of women who major in STEM studies, which has nothing to do with getting a job and paying, women major in humanities much more than men do. Men are just interested in this stuff more. That's not a terrible thing. I don't see why that.
Yeah, but I mean, like, there's societal influence that occurs even before the college level, right? I mean,
I don't know that there are a lot of people saying to a 7th grade girl who's good at math, you need to stop that and go read some poetry. I mean, like, listen, I have 3 younger sisters, right? I have, my wife is a doctor, by the way. So talking about STEM, my wife's a doctor. My mom runs companies. That's what she does. So I'm very much for women in the workplace and being able for them to choose what they want to choose. I really don't see a lot, if you can tell me the person who's out there going, women in science, fie, then I'll stand with you and say, yeah, that person's adult. That's really stupid. You know, if a woman wants to go into science and she's qualified for the job the same way that an equally qualified guy is, great. What I don't want is lowering of standards in science to meet any particular person, and I also don't want this idea that because a woman chooses not to go into science, and a lot of women choose not to go into science, and that creates a disproportionate percentage based on individual choice, that suddenly this is some sort of group discrimination happening in front of us.
Hi, thank you for coming. I do not disagree with a lot that you just said. That's why I'm here. Yeah, so let's talk about institutions, because you're saying we should not blame the institutions. I have an example, and please tell me why you think, you know, that person per se is not victimized. So let's start with the beginning of a life. You're a baby, you were born into a really poor family, in a really poor community, where the school is not good. Where crimes are high. You as a baby, I think, you're quite helpless there. And I would, according to my thinking, I would say that's quite unequal. And that is, I feel like that person, because if you think about education, that should be a public good. In my opinion, it should be provided equally in all communities instead of just based on how rich your house is. Just could you respond to that?
So so if I'm getting your question straight, there's a bit of an echo here. So you're suggesting that children grow up in unequal circumstances because of the school district they go to. Not all schools are equal. There are a lot of public schools that are garbage, and so kids don't have an equal access to success.
Yes, and I feel like in my world, in my political thinking, I think that is inequality, and that is institutions failing people. So I agree with you that not all public schools are good, and I agree with you that there is such a thing as inequality. Of course there's such a thing as inequality. We're not all born in the same place. We're not all born equally intelligent. We're not all born with equal gifts. Some of us are born smart but short and will never play in the NBA. We're not all born, this is just a truism. The question is there inequity? Right? Is there an equity that needs to be remedied? And the question then is, what's the best way to remedy that inequity? So when you say that there's inequality, is that because there are a bunch of rich people who are screwing those poor kids out of a good school? I don't think so, because we're spending oodles of money in the public schools, particularly in poor areas, and it's not paying off very well.
What I would suggest is that the best possible solution is to devolve those dollars back to parents who presumably care about those kids more than the public school system does and allow them to choose the schools for their children. So I can agree with you that there's inequality. Then the question becomes, okay, how do we solve that problem? So again, inequality and inequity are not the same thing, and equating the two, I think, is a mistake. You can do a follow-up, that's fine.
Thank you. So I feel like, if we're getting really scholarly and academic here, that is exactly what Rousseau is saying, essentially talking about natural inequality and contrived inequality. Natural inequality would be inequality that you're saying, inequity would be the contrived one. And I feel like now in our society, the institutions is contributing to the ultimate contrived inequality, in the sense that children just do not have access to the same level of education. Granted, if they.
Well, I mean, so if we're going to construct utopia and then suggest all children are going to have the same level of education, that's just not reality. Okay, there's no place on earth that has that because that's just not the case. So you're right that there's a difference between difference in smarts and difference in the poverty situation in which you grew up. But the truth is that the biggest inequality is the biggest inequity and inequality, I would say, is parents who decide to get pregnant out of wedlock. I mean, if you want to look at academic underperformance, it has much less to do with the school that you go to and much more to do with your family situation at home. Again, I'm not arguing with you that any of these things are a problem. The question is, quote unquote, who's to blame? And I think this is where we get into a problem in politics, because the idea is that the person to blame must be the rich guy down the street. I don't think it's the rich guy's fault. I think that there are certain things in life that just aren't fair. And then the question becomes, okay, how do we maximize opportunity without invading the rights of somebody else? And I think the easiest way to do that is to let people keep more of their own money and to do more to privatize the school system and give people more choice.
Okay,
thank you. I appreciate it.
Hi, first off, I just want to say thank you for speaking as a fellow Jewish conservative. Thank you so much for coming.
It's just the two of us, man.
So I wanted to ask you, do you believe that there's an explanation for why victimization has become the main tactic of the far left to gain support of the people?
Yes. So I think, first of all, I do think victimization was always a tactic of the far left. It was just economic victimization, right? Marxism is based on the idea that the proletariat are going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeois, that there's this vast group of underprivileged people, as they call it, who are going to rise up and they're going to break the chains that bind them and take over the world. So it was always based on this notion that you're being victimized by somebody else. But in the 1960s particularly, it was clear that as America was thriving so much in the 1950s economically, and America had become this great world power, the prominent world power in terms of the economy, it was very hard to make the case to people who are not as wealthy that you need to rise up against the country that's creating all your wealth. And so instead what the left decided to do was misdirect into a legitimate grievance, which was an ethnic-based and sex-based grievance, which made a lot more sense in the 1950s and 60s than it does in 2017. And so there's this idea that if we identify you as groups, we can use those groups to tear down the American infrastructure, this system that's been built by white men for the privilege of white men. And we couldn't tear that down based on class, because it turns out a lot of poor people in the United States still wanted to get rich, and they need that system to get rich. But you can do it based on group identity. Because if you can make women feel that the system is designed to keep them down, if you can make black people feel like the system is designed to keep them down, and then you can tell them that it's the capitalist system more generally that is designed to keep them down, and that whole system, the whole superstructure is rife with racism, it has to be torn out root and branch. If you can do that, then you can actually build a movement on the back of that. And that's what you're seeing in the Democratic Party actually right now. It's fascinating to watch the conflict between sort of the Obama identity politics Democratic Party and the Bernie Sanders Socialist Democratic Party. Because that's actually an old battle, right? I mean, that's the battle between economic, class distinction-based victimization and identity politics-based victimization, which is really more what Obama used in 2012 to win re-election.
So would you say this is more of like get-rich-quick scheme, or if I can't be rich, no one can?
Well, I think that it depends on which people you're talking about. The people who buy into the idea of victimization, I don't think it's a get-rich-quick scheme so much as an I feel victimized scheme and I don't feel like taking responsibility. But for the people at the top, I think that it actually is a get-rich-quick scheme. I think the people at the top very often know exactly what they are doing and know, because they don't live like this, right? I mean, Barack Obama didn't live his life thinking of himself as a dramatic victim of society until he decided to write Dreams for My Father and revise everything, right? But the fact is that Barack Obama is a guy who really achieved his whole life. I mean, he was an achiever. And if he had been sitting around thinking how victimized he was his whole life, it would have been very difficult for him to get where he got.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much.